My first encounter with a Tudor miniature was at school. It was for A-level, and a beautiful example was projected enormously upon the wall. And it wasn't then till 5 or 6 years later that I encountered a real miniature in the flesh. And I remember being so knocked back by how something so small could loom, emotionally speaking, so large. As this unique collection of miniatures reveals, the miniature had a particular part to play as a tangible expression of love and poetical regard from one person to another. In the words of Shakespeare, who else? With my love's picture, then mine eye doth feast. These miniatures represent the apogee of a particularly English genre of art that was produced in the late Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. And a woman who has devoted much of her time to understanding and interpreting them is Dr. Elizabeth Goldring.
Well, the miniature was a highly personal, highly private image, unlike an oil painting designed to hang on a wall in a long gallery and to be seen by many. A miniature was often intended just for the eyes of the original recipient. So miniatures were often exchanged between lovers, between fiancés, between husbands and wives, parents and children. They were portable, which was a great advantage in an era long before the invention of the photograph, much less the instantly communicable imagery of the mobile telephone. A miniature could be carried in the pocket. It could be encased in a piece of jewelry and worn on the person in a locket or in a brooch affixed to the heart. It was in many ways the polar opposite of a large oil painting designed to hang in a long gallery. These miniatures are some of the finest I have ever seen. They are exceptionally crisp, vibrant of color. They look as though they could have been painted yesterday. They are a tangible link to a golden age of English miniature painting. The miniatures in the Bearsted Collection were painted by some of the finest practitioners of this art, including Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver. Hilliard was court limner to Elizabeth I and James I, and he was also in many ways the founding father of English art, the first native-born painter to achieve an international reputation for excellence during his own lifetime. One of the most spectacular miniatures in the Bearsted Collection is a portrait of Elizabeth, Countess of Huntingdon by Nicholas Hilliard. Elizabeth, Countess of Huntingdon, was a great supporter of court masques and court entertainments, which were allegorical performances that were staged at court with very lavish sets and costumes, and it was an opportunity for ladies of the court to perform, something that would never have happened, of course, in the public theatres. It's an extraordinary image. We have the sitter with her long locks unfurled, which would suggest either that she is unmarried or that she is in masking costume. If it is Elizabeth, Countess of Huntingdon, she would have been almost certainly married by this date, so this would suggest she is portrayed in masking attire, perhaps as a goddess. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a heart pierced by an arrow, dripping blood, and this is accompanied by 2 Latin mottos on the theme of constancy in love. So perhaps this was a gift to a lover or admirer. Perhaps this was something that was commissioned to commemorate the allegorical framework of a particular masque or entertainment. Again, we don't know exactly what the circumstances were that gave rise to the commissioning of this particular miniature. Hilliard believed that it was part of his job, perhaps the chief part of his job, to flatter his sitters, to make them look their best selves, particularly if he was portraying a lady. And he is very explicit about this in his treatise on miniature painting, that it's the portraitist's job to make the lady look as pretty as she possibly can. Oliver hasn't left behind a treatise on miniature painting, but he seems to have taken a slightly different approach, to have attempted to portray his sitters as objectively as possible, as if in the cold light of day. Well, what I find so extraordinary about this particular miniature is the precision with which Oliver has rendered the individual hairs in the sitter's beard, moustache, and eyebrows. Even under tremendous magnification, each hair is individually delineated. Hard to believe that that was painted over 400 years ago. Here we have a wonderful miniature of a lady traditionally identified as Catherine, Countess of Huntingdon, and this is a good example of the care and attention that Oliver always lavished on the rendering of his sitters' jewelry and clothing. So here we see the Countess with pearls in her hair and her ears. She's got a lovely thin black silk strand around her neck, which of course is set off very nicely against the fairness of her skin. The Jacobeans thought that fair skin was the height of fashion for a well-bred lady. And of particular interest in this miniature is her ruff, which is a pale yellow color, which is a little bit different to the pure white ruffs we're used to seeing. The presence of the pale yellow ruff helps us to date the miniature quite precisely to the 1610s. Well, this is another wonderful miniature by Oliver. It is slightly unusual in showing the sitter in profile. This is a format that Oliver reserved for his most socially exalted sitters. The profile portrait has its roots in antiquity in ancient Rome. It was a format that was used for depicting ancient Roman rulers on coins and medals, hence Oliver having reserved this format for his most exalted sitters. Who this lady was remains something of a mystery, but she was clearly well born and presumably also a great patron of the court masque or court entertainment. This is another wonderful miniature by Oliver. We think that it was probably painted to commemorate Eleanor Davis's engagement. Miniatures were often commissioned as love tokens, and I should think this one almost certainly was. The sitter's hair is long and loose, suggesting she was unmarried, but she holds her hair to her breast in a very romantic, very erotic gesture. This is just the type of image that one would expect to have been commissioned to mark an engagement and to have been gifted to her fiancé. It's important to remember that in the early 17th century there is a certain amount of concern in England about young women getting up to traditionally male pursuits. In fact, there was a pamphlet published in 1620 called Hic Mulier, the man-woman, which railed against the insolency of our women and their wearing of broad-brimmed hats and pointed doublets. And when I hear that quote, when I read that quote, I can't help but think of this young woman so brilliantly portrayed by Oliver. She's wearing a masculine-style doublet, paired with a masculine style hat. The way in which a single strand of her hair has been brought forward is a masculine tradition known as a lovelock. We don't know why she is in such masculine attire. Is she possibly in costume for a performance in a court masque? Is she simply experimenting with her identity? We just don't know. We may never know. She, one suspects, might have been rather rebellious and a lady of action. I love the way in which Oliver has captured the pendant pearls as if still in motion, as though she has just a moment ago rushed into his studio from her busy day and taken her seat, and the pearls haven't yet stopped moving. Hilliard and Oliver dominated miniature painting in England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but there were many other talented practitioners of this art whose names have not always come down to us. There's a beautiful miniature in the Bearsted Collection of Venetia Stanley, which has been painted by an unknown artist. We have catalogued it as English School, but whoever he or she was clearly very talented indeed. There is another miniature in the Bearsted Collection which is attributed to Rowland Locke, who was another of Hilliard's pupils. Indeed, he studied alongside Oliver in Hilliard's workshop in the 1580s in London. So it's a very rich period. Hilliard and Oliver are the giants of the era, of this great golden age of miniature painting. As a group, these miniatures give us a wonderful insight not only into the range of artists working in England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but also into the variety of uses to which portrait miniatures were put. And here we see in the Bearsted Collection really the whole range and infinite variety of the court miniature at its peak in late 16th and early 17th century England.
So how did this uniquely important collection of miniatures come together? Lawrence Hendra has been looking into the man who made it all possible in the early 20th century, the second Lord Bearsted.
If you were an art dealer or an auctioneer active in the 1920s or 1930s in London, Walter Samuel would have been a name you most certainly would have been familiar with. I mean, he was one of the most important collectors of his generation. He was the son of Marcus Samuel, the first Viscount Bearsted, who was a founder of Royal Dutch Shell, and that's where the family fortune came from. And when Samuel took over the role of chairman in 1921, he was able to build the most incredible collections. I mean, from soft paste porcelain all the way through to works by El Greco or Tintoretto. I mean, his collection was staggering for its breadth. And so what really emerged during the process of researching Walter as a collector was actually his passion, but also actually I think his obsession. I mean, he clearly was a collector who enjoyed the process of buying. It was said that at times he had to hide his recent acquisitions under the bed in the spare bedroom, away from the prying eyes of his wife. Some pictures didn't even make it to the walls of his house. In 1948, Walter left Upton House to the National Trust along with the bulk of his collection, and the very generous gift was also followed by an endowment which is rumoured to be one of the largest the National Trust had received at that date. Other works, including the portrait miniatures here, were retained by the family, and we had the opportunity recently to acquire these portrait miniatures from a descendant. Walter Samuel was a collector who had the eye of a connoisseur. It wasn't just the grand full-length swagger portraits by Rumney or Reynolds that he collected, but he also had an interest in the smaller works, the works which he could sort of study and hold and examine firsthand. I suppose he had an almost sort of antiquarian mindset in that regard. And in the 1920s and 1930s, when Walter was collecting portrait miniatures, they were actually experiencing a resurgence of interest in the public consciousness. There were exhibitions that were being staged in public galleries. You had major collectors such as Pierpont Morgan in the States building the most incredible collection of objects. I mean, these things were accessible then. I mean, a lot of the great miniatures are now in museums, but don't forget, back in the 20s and 30s, these works could be bought if you had the funds to do so. So he was able to amass a really incredible collection. So Walter clearly had an interest in portraiture, and that much becomes clear when you study his collection at Upton. And I think that's really reflected in this group of miniatures, because they all have a very strong sense of character. They're all engaging in their very own distinctive way, and united, of course, just by their overall quality and richness of imagery.
This collection will now undoubtedly move into new hands, into a new collector, but whoever they may be, they are bound to be entranced, bewitched, as I'm sure the original commissioners of these miniatures were, the subsequent generations, the collectors, the second Lord Bearsted, who so thoughtfully put this collection together. And we ourselves feel incredibly lucky to have been their temporary custodians.